I said, I am very excited to introduce Professor Steph Shuster, who, as many of you know, is Associate Professor in Lyman Briggs College and in the Department of Sociology here at MSU. Their current research in gender, medicine, and feminist science and technology studies considers how evidence is constructed, mobilized, and weaponized. And this is the subject of their book, Transmedicine, the Emergence and Practice of Treating Gender, which came out with NYU Press in 2021. And as I said, we are very excited. I am personally very excited to hear this talk today. So Professor Shuster, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Mindy. I want to go ahead and just take a moment to share my screen and get a little set up here. Okay. And if I could just get maybe a thumbs up from someone that you can see the screen.
I can see it. Looks great.
Right, great, thank you. Well, again, thank you so much for being here, and also to the GenCen for inviting me into this space to present this work. I'm actually gonna meander off of Transmedicine, my first book, and present some new data. So just a heads up, this is still very much a work in progress. So let me go ahead and get started. My findings from the first book, which Mindy shared, was called Transmedicine, inspired me to continue exploring the social life of evidence and how knowledge can travel across scientific and medical communities. So in Transmedicine, I examine how providers began to build a canon of knowledge about how to work with trans people that was rooted in a lot of uncertainty, fraught scientific evidence, and also challenges to themselves as experts. This new project sits at the intersection of reproductive health, feminist science and technology studies, and also inequalities. So as I was wrapping up Transmedicine, I was particularly compelled by a thread of an idea that traces throughout the first part from historical data on how medical providers and scientists were incredibly concerned with trans people having children or being involved in children's lives, their relationships and sexual desires. So today I'm going to try my best to present two sections from what I imagine as chapter 1 and 2 of this new book project that I'm tentatively titling Trans Reproduction, Creating Productive and Socially Fit Transgender People. I'll start with some historical context before I shift to discussing gaps in knowledge, the research questions that motivate the talk, and then I'll get into some results. So I just want to note, because I should, and it's a generous support by the National Science Foundation Career Grant, and this project is also supported by a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. So let's get into it. All right, let me set the stage for folks who aren't familiar with what's happening in this time period. Late 19th century ideas about supporting the public welfare by inhibiting the moral, physical, and racial impurity affected a broad swath of the US population, including people with disabilities, sexually active women, homosexuals referred to at the time, the poor, people of color, and immigrants who were labeled as deviant, abnormal, and or feeble-minded. And when I speak in this presentation, just imagine that I'm consistently using air quotes when I use language that we would now find insulting. In response to these concerns about trying to protect the social body in future generations, a multi-pronged state-sponsored approach included forced sterilization, institutionalization, and social welfare campaigns to remove so-called defectives and degenerates from social life. It was assumed by politicians, scientists, and the medical profession that improvement of the, no, sorry, that's a little too fast. Improvement of the nation's hereditary pool could and should be achieved by discouraging the reproduction of some, while encouraging the reproductive capacities of others. As many scholars have described, following World War II, state-sponsored programs began a shift away from coercive sterilization to encourage respectable reproduction by white, middle-class, heterosexual families. But the state's vested interest in maintaining the health of future generations and also the health of society continued to shape policies, programs, and also medical and scientific thought. With post-war economic recovery efforts underway and government incentive programs to help predominantly young white heterosexual families attain a middle-class life, through home financing, mid-20th century US life was often upheld as a golden era for the traditional family household and gender relations. Coercive reproduction, as I've already suggested, was no longer considered as acceptable of a tool for addressing undesirable people as it had in the early 20th century. But in targeting sex and heterosexual reproduction, only certain kinds of families and the institution of marriage were heralded as viable solutions to ensure the success of the nation. So there are a lot of histories that have been written about the scientific and medical community's complicity in propagating coercive reproductive control against a broad swath of people, but how transgender people figure into these historical legacies and continue to experience the spillover effects of it in contemporary social life has not been adequately addressed. This is puzzling as there are scholars who have identified the role of early 20th century medical providers and scientists and how they depicted gender variation as a so-called deviance to control through punitive measures such as incarceration, institutionalization, and also sterilization. So the questions that motivate the talk today are, first of all, what are some of these historical legacies of reproductive and social control from the early 20th century that can be traced into the mid-20th century, which is where most of my historical work is concentrated? And also, what are the consequences of these trends on trans people during this era? Trans reproduction advances the claim that we need to understand the history of trans medicine in the US with consideration of how reproductive and social control shape trans people's experiences and how providers are borrowing ideas from their early 20th century counterparts to make sense of trans people's relationships, their involvement with children, as well as their social fitness to be so-called productive citizens in everyday life. To offer a sense of the methods and the data that I'll be drawing upon today, I'll start with the Kinsey Institute. It's located at Indiana University Bloomington's campus, at least for now. We can talk more about that in the Q&A. And I'm really drawing on two different collections. One is the Harry Benjamin collection. If you're unfamiliar with who that is, he was an internationally recognized endocrinologist who had a really prominent role in the development of medical knowledge and treatment plans for trans people in the mid-20th century. This collection includes letters of correspondence between providers to other providers and patients. There's also medical histories in there. And in addition to the Benjamin collection, I'm also drawing from the John Money collection, who, if you're unfamiliar with this person, in the mid-20th century was a sexologist and psychologist who was instrumental also in developing knowledge about trans identity. This collection, like the Benjamin collection, also includes letters of correspondence and John Money's personal note-taking on a lot of the clinical trials that he was running. I also want to note that right now data collection is ongoing with the Digital Transgender Archives. I have a graduate student and two undergraduate students who are amazing. And I just want to, call out Jess, Rithika, and Kira for their ongoing and excellent research assistance. All right, so I'm going to start with social fitness, and then I'm going to pivot to presenting some of the results on reproductive control. So I'll start with gender normativity as an indicator of social fitness, and then shift to mental illness, and then how doctors and scientists thought of trans people and what trans people might do to convince scientists and doctors that they were productive members of society. To sort through the growing number of people requesting access to hormones and surgical interventions, in the 1950s and into the 1960s, the medical establishment began to extensively document the embodied characteristics of trans people. From their perspective, such cataloging was to help the scientific community create new classifications of sex, gender, and sexuality, and also finer-grained distinctions between abnormal and normal bodies. But in doing so, providers often use these data to justify their decisions about who should or should not have access to surgical and/or hormonal interventions. Often it was based on the perception that only gender-normative people could be socially fit. So appearance was a key justification for denying trans people access to interventions. From their perspective, if a trans woman was too masculine or a trans man was too feminine, upon transitioning, they would consistently move through social life detected by others as trans. And before I share any quotes, I also want to say that, with this data being from the 1950s to the 1970s, there are some terms and ideas that are insulting to trans people. So one psychiatrist shared, some time ago, a man, and they also misgendered trans people a lot. Some time ago, a man consulted me, one of the most cantankerous, unattractive, masculine-looking people imaginable. He was even heavily tattooed. And I just didn't feel I could approve surgery for him because he had so many problems and any way would have made a most unconvincing looking woman. So providers often conflated gender normativity, attractiveness, and dispositions to portray many trans people in unfavorable terms and then cast them out of their clinics. But I want to suggest that gender policing was not unidirectional. There were some trans people that took on informant roles, especially with Harry Benjamin. He comes up a lot in these archives, and other providers with whom they grew close. Sometimes trans people would even send in reports to Benjamin about other trans people. So as one trans woman wrote to Benjamin, I had to go downtown last week. I haven't been into downtown LA in almost a year. And who should I run into but this trans person? Oh, Dr. Benjamin, I have never seen anything so obvious and Slavic in all my life. I hated to stand there and talk with her. I was embarrassed, all gaudily dressed, complete with blonde wig. So similar in the criticism of one's gender presentation that appeared in the medical correspondence from the previous slide, and often between physicians, this trans person's description of meeting another trans person was burdened with assumptions of so-called proper appearance and behavior. Framed within concerns of respectability, being gender normative and undetectable as trans while out and about in social life was celebrated. Moreover, I just want to highlight from this quote that in describing the trans person as, quote, gaudily dressed and obvious, the underlying idea was that this person was unfit and perhaps even insinuating that she was poor, thereby excluding her from surgical or hormonal interventions because she would not be able to demonstrate social fitness with her assumed low-class appearance. The medical establishment sought assurances that the patients with whom they agreed to work also were not mentally ill. This was a difficult standard for many trans people to meet, as a lot of providers and scientists assumed that trans people were mentally unstable. Physicians speculated about the psychological health of their patients and their ability to cope with life challenges after transitioning. And there was in the 50s and 60s, there was such an array of diagnostic categories at their disposal, such as neuroses, schizophrenia, delusion, depression. Providers had a lot of flexibility in their justifications for denying trans people access to care. Suicide ideation was understood by some providers as symbolic of an individual's faulty character and inability to be socially fit members of society. For example, one surgeon contacted Benjamin to warn that a mutual patient had shared with the surgeon that she had reached her limit and was considering suicide. As the surgeon concluded with Benjamin, of course, this indicates an instability of character to such an extent that the patient would be dangerous if things did not go exactly to his liking. It gives me very cold feet about taking him on as an operative possibility. In casting blame on the trans person for suicide ideation, the surgeon suggests that the trans person might pose a danger to the surgeon if there were post-surgical complications. Benjamin, in response, sympathetically reached out to the patient and wrote, "You did wrong in writing him that whether you actually meant it or not, he feels now that you may be emotionally too unbalanced to be operated on." So Benjamin here is offering guidance to some of his patients by coaching them on what to avoid saying to surgeons and therapists to help them access care. In his published works too, Benjamin attempted to garner sympathy among his colleagues and was an early advocate of the idea that some trans people's depression or if they had suicide ideation might be alleviated if they were allowed to access gender-affirming care. So providers and scientists, in addition to looking for mental illness and gender normativity, were also incredibly concerned about trans people becoming so-called productive citizens. They used indicators to determine ideal candidates for interventions and also to socially control them. Questionable finances augmented providers' concerns about trans people. So a lot of providers asked for documentation that trans people could afford interventions and also were gainfully employed. As one physician wrote to Benjamin about a patient pursuing surgical interventions, he tells us that he's lived as a woman in 1953 and 1954 when he was employed as a hairstylist. Presently, he lives with his father and mother and does nothing. A clear sign for not recommending this patient for surgery from the perspective of the physician was that she lacked employment, or in his words, does nothing. Many trans people were infantilized during this era, which offered yet another justification for providers to deny trans people access to care. Jules Gill-Peterson has observed that it was during this era that medical and scientific communities assumed that childhood gender, what she calls plasticity, made it easier to promote gender and racial conformity. And while the infantilization of adult trans people helped providers maintain almost an exclusive authority over decision-making processes, not all trans people were treated with such sympathy. So in one patient report, a therapist noted that this patient has had a lot of sexual contacts, both in prostitution and outside of it. While there can be no doubt that the patient is extremely promiscuous, his claims of overwhelming sexual desires should be regarded with some skepticism. His infantilism is such that every desire demands an instant gratification. So with the desire for so-called instant gratification, the trans person failed to uphold this cherished value of American exceptionalism that if one works hard enough, they can achieve financial success and also have respectable lives. While post-World War II government programs offered new possibilities for people to establish nuclear families, homeownership, and attain middle-class life, a lot of these programs were not open to all people. So what I'm going to do now is kind of shift us into thinking carefully about what it means to live a respectable life before we get into some of the reproductive control. A lot of times there was a shift in responsibility onto marginalized people to attain a so-called respectable life that was open to so few. And that meant that for trans people, they had to go to great efforts to demonstrate their worth as patients and also as economically productive members of society. As one trans man seeking access to surgical interventions wrote to Benjamin, "I've had a good paying job and can easily afford to spend a few $100s a month on medical expenses. I'd like to know where and what to spend it on. I would like the names of any doctors in my area who can help me. I'm not at all happy with the way things are now and want to change them. I'm happy with my new job, which I've had for a year. It's a man's job, which requires a lot of oneself, but there's still so much I cannot do merely because I'm stuck in a female body. Would you please help me?" So in documenting his financial stability and also his masculine job, this trans man is offering the kind of rationale of being worthy of care that providers began to expect. Appealing to Benjamin's sympathy to help him was strategic, as it situated him in a subservient role that enabled Benjamin to play the role of the heroic doctor. Unfortunately, Benjamin had retired several years previous, and the physician who took on Benjamin's patients suggested that, quote, "I certainly feel that you do need to speak with some doctors familiar with transsexualism. Unfortunately, I know of no one in your area who could be of help to you. Should you be able to come to New York City, however, I would be happy to see you in consultation myself." To be clear, providers were open to some ideas or behaviors that trans people might have that others may have found odd. And again, this goes back to like the mental health concern, the concerns that providers had that trans people showed signs of like, moral degeneracy because they might have been mentally ill. So if a trans person could demonstrate that despite so-called oddities or peculiarities, and this is all from the perspective of scientists and doctors, that they could still be productive members of society and they were given a pass. So one trans person sought Benjamin's help finding a surgeon, requested to have ovaries and a uterus implanted. Benjamin wrote to a surgeon that, quote, "Of course, this could only be of psychological benefit. I've tried to discourage this idea of his, but to no avail, as his desire is dictated by emotion and not by reason. This information, I trust, will enable you to accept him as a patient. He is, of course, an intelligent, educated person, financially responsible, and thoroughly reliable." In this instance, having educational degrees and being gainfully employed outweighed the patient's so-called non-compliance with Benjamin's medical advice to stop pursuing having ovary and uterus implantation. It was not only because of scientific curiosity that providers were willing to overlook these unusual requests by patients, and also in the name of social fitness. Some providers expressed a sympathetic stance about the financial precarity of trans people and placed blame on the lack of social infrastructures instead of trans people themselves. As one nurse observed, sorry, this is a long quote, "I consider vocational rehabilitation services to be an extremely valuable aspect of the total process of rehabilitation because their education and job experience usually is severely limited. The rehab workers administer intelligence and vocational aptitude tests and then proceed to job counseling. And where this is indicated, we refer people in our program to state agencies that will assist them to continue their education or enroll in job training programs. Even a small measure of social success goes quite a long way for people who have enjoyed so little." So this nurse's efforts to offer job counseling and help trans people gain employment opportunities were couched within a compassionate response to a group of people that she recognizes as having experienced hardship. Yet the benevolence of the nurse is similar to early 20th century social welfare and what were at the time called charity campaigns to lift up groups of people, especially people with disabilities and those in poverty, in the name of creating socially fit and productive people, which also had the unintended consequence of exacerbating the oppression that these groups experienced. All right, I'm going to take a drink of water. So what I want to do now is kind of shift our attention to the ways that trans people's reproductive capacity was controlled, and thinking through those so-called right kinds of relationships. And I might speed up just a little bit because I have so much material I want to present, but of course, I won't be able to do everything. In addition to asserting social control over trans people, the medical establishment went to great efforts to ensure that trans people were in, from their perspective, the right kinds of relationships. Many trans people who had families or saw themselves upon transitioning to have families were often denied access to care. Yet alongside restrictions placed on trans people to have children, providers also sought to regulate trans people's romantic relationships and their sexual behaviors. So trans people, for example, who experienced pleasure from their genitals or enjoyed having sex before surgical intervention were met with a lot of suspicion by medical and scientific communities because these types of behaviors were not acceptable in so-called proper society. Masturbation comes up a lot in the archives. It was understood by medical and scientific communities as indicative of social decay, and therefore needed to be ameliorated to ensure that respectable families could have children. And this is like broadly in society during this time. These sentiments about the deplorable nature of masturbation were carried by providers into their work with trans people. Masturbation was held against trans people as not only signs of unfitness and decay, but also that a patient was not really trans. So in one brochure that was circulated among a small group of providers, a psychiatrist suggested that one of the most important indicators is masturbation. For the transsexual, the rate is usually very low because they have such a strong antipathy toward their organ that they won't even confirm that they have it by touching it. Trans people who might experience pleasure from their bodies before transitioning were unfathomable to providers because of this narrative that began to emerge during the time that trans people felt that they were born in the wrong body and disassociated from their bodies, especially their genitals. When trans people reported masturbating, it often was in the context of fantasizing that they had already undergone surgical interventions. As reflected in one case report, sexual activity started at age 12 when another boy masturbated him. The patient continued to masturbate 2 times a week after that, but gradually lost interest in it. He presently masturbates very infrequently. In these contexts, the patient sees himself as a female. Promiscuity and having a history of sexually transmitted infections were interpreted by medical and scientific communities that an individual had a dubious character and was dangerous to society. For example, during a case presentation of what was called the Gender Identity Committee, the following discussion ensued about a patient's romantic affections as falling within the permissible boundaries because she, quote, owns no male attire, lives and works entirely as a female, has never been married, states she has never had intercourse with a female and found it revolting. To further solidify the patient as a worthwhile case to consider for surgical interventions, the report went on to mention that she attends Catholic Church, but cannot practice entirely because she won't dress in male attire, no history of venereal disease, does not drink, smoke, or use drugs. With no marital partner to worry about and someone who is religiously inclined, chaste, cautious, and restrained in using substances, this patient represented an exemplary candidate for surgery because she met all the indicators for an ideal patient and also was a socially fit trans person. Heterosexuality upon transitioning was another crucial factor for how providers sorted through ideal candidates and how trans people could demonstrate that they were able to lead productive lives in socially acceptable relationships. So in another case report, a patient's sexual history was presented succinctly as, has had sexual relationships with males, found it unsatisfactory, butch with females, has a girlfriend, no pregnancies or abortions, makes very good impression dressed as male. So this trans man is an ideal patient because he found sex with males to be unsatisfactory and desired to have girlfriends and uphold traditional gender norms where men were expected to be sexually dominant in romantic relationships. As further evidence of what was emerging during this time as a heteronormative mandate for trans people, the medical community rejoiced when they were able to dissuade a trans person who, upon transitioning, would be socially regarded as being in a queer relationship. Like masturbation, homosexuality was symptomatic of the decaying fabric of society. So as one therapist observed about a patient, I felt he couldn't be a true transsexual because he was so completely heterosexual and hadn't had any homosexual experiences. When the moment was right, I asked him, "What do you want to be, a lesbian?" And that crystallized the contradiction for him, and now he's happily married. For this individual, the operation would have been a tragic mistake. Trans people were likely aware that providers expected them to not express any homosexual romantic attraction after transitioning and emphasized their disgust for homosexual relationships in a lot of their letters of correspondence to physicians and also in the autobiographical narratives that they sometimes were asked to write by therapists. As one trans woman shared, "Girls don't do a thing for me, to me or for me. I've rarely dated. I simply don't want to date girls. I don't feel the need or the desire. I've never had any homosexual relations with any man. I didn't want a dirty, sneaky, behind the back or in the closet relationship." So narrating her sexual desire, this trans woman accentuated how she was interested in men, but only after transitioning. Otherwise, the relationship will be regarded as homosexual. So waiting for surgical intervention could ensure that she fulfilled her sexual desire for men, but only in a respectable romantic relationship. As another patient wrote to Benjamin, I've only ever used discretion on my part in not associating with the wrong people or going to the wrong places. I do not frequent or go to gay bars as I have little or no use to them. To which Benjamin confirmed, I was glad indeed to read of your sensible attitude and believe as you do that it is most important not to associate with the wrong people. Benjamin's response echoed at the time discourse about the repugnant character of gay people that was prevalent in the mid-20th century and thus used homosexual relationships as a basis for denying trans people access to care. Married trans people who requested access to surgical interventions were often cast out as flawed candidates for medical interventions. Many trans people emphasized in their letters of correspondence how unhappy they were in their marriages. They also mentioned how they almost never had sex with their spouses, and more so admired their spouses for their gender expression and not because of sexual attraction, to avoid undercutting their claims to post-transition heterosexual desire. So as one trans woman reflected on her marriage to a woman, our sexual contact was very seldom. I think now my only interest in her was more of a fascination, for she was the woman I would have liked to have been. We had no children and were divorced after 2 years. The medical community encouraged married trans people to get divorced or give up the idea of transitioning. As one psychiatrist advised, quote, "It's essential that divorce proceedings conclude prior to surgery." Married trans people held the promise that one day they might stop identifying as trans and eventually have children within their heterosexual marriages. So as another psychiatrist reflected, in the next hour, I'll be seeing a man who's one of these very pushing, insistent people who wants me to okay the operation right now. I'm proceeding very deliberately because in this case, I have my doubts. This person is with a woman and was having sex with her right up to the time he began taking hormones. She's in love with him and she's very upset that he wants the operation. As the psychiatrist made clear, a responsible spouse would not want to upset their partner, and the partner's desire to stay in the relationship outweighed a trans person's need to have surgical interventions. The psychiatrist eventually denied the request for surgery. Married trans people had some knowledge that they were expected to obtain a divorce before transitioning, and that being unwilling to give up their children discredited them in the eyes of the medical community. So as one trans man wrote to Benjamin, "I wrote you a few years ago in regards to possibly having a sex reassignment surgery. I'm 23 now, my husband and I are long separated, and I no longer have my children to look after, and I'm still very much interested in your help." Benjamin responded enthusiastically, asking the trans man to arrange an appointment with him, to begin hormones, and to start the process of finding a surgeon with whom he might work. Influenced by older ideas from the earlier 20th century, protecting children from corruption or exposure to people of ill repute was a prevalent societal concern that was echoed by providers of trans medicine. Trans people could demonstrate having a reputable character if they desired to be free from the constraints of having had children in previous relationships. So those who were unwilling to leave their children risked being denied access to care. As an attorney wrote to Benjamin, sorry, there's like some longer quotes, but I'm about to get to wrap up. About 3 weeks ago, I received a rather pathetic letter from a patient. She's destitute and is concerned because her children have been advised of her problem and because the present spouse of her former spouse wants to adopt them. I did suggest that she might seek legal aid, but was forced to point out that if she was not supporting the children, an adoption could take place without her consent. Benjamin agreed with the attorney. Quote, "A few months ago, I wrote to her that I thought it would be better for her children's future not to grow up with a father who lives as a woman. I thought she should not oppose the adoption and should be willing to make a sacrifice as long as she wants to continue her present form of living." So as reflected within their letters, the medical community thought it was irresponsible and sometimes even dangerous for trans people to be involved in children's lives. Moreover, from Benjamin's observations, giving up claims to guardianship was an ultimate sacrifice that trans people could do to prove that they were worthy of gender-affirming care. Right. So, as I've suggested throughout this talk, a central lens through which providers made decisions was based on controlling the reproductive capacity and ensuring the social fitness of trans people. This links mid-20th century trans medicine to early 20th century ideas about markers of degeneracy that became weaponized by medical and scientific communities to control the bodily autonomy and also the reproductive capacities of marginalized people. In seeking to assess social fitness, providers created double standards for their patients. So trans people were asked to be gender normative, while providers assumed that most were unable to move through social life undetected as trans. The project of cataloging embodied sex characteristics and gender expression of trans people was influenced by older ideas seeking to control members of society by creating distinctions between so-called normal and abnormal. As disability studies scholars have suggested, there are far-reaching consequences for engaging in this way of thinking of normal and abnormal bodies. Some are valued, while those who are outside the norms are often labeled as deviant. So creating criteria for abnormal bodies conferred authority to medical and scientific communities to regulate, surveil, and control so-called unruly bodies. Anyone whose gender expression or life circumstances that was outside of those boundaries, that was tethered to bodily displays, financial standing, sexual desire, and practices, did not align with ideas of social fitness and being able to be productive members of society. Placing trans people in a lose-lose situation, many could not uphold the expectations imposed upon them by the medical establishment. Providers also wanted to ensure that their patients would be in heterosexual relationships after they transitioned, as these were the most prized relationships for a productive and valuable member of society. But simultaneously, they also assumed that trans people would not and should not have children or stay in their previous marriages. In their written reports, providers frequently commented on the, quote, so-called delusional fantasies that trans people could have of marital life. As one psychiatrist reflected, quote, the patient is almost obsessed with the idea of obtaining the operation. He does not have a realistic idea of the results of the operation or what the future holds for him. He wants to get married, have children, and start a home. So providers of trans medicine, I think the ultimate claim here is that they're joining a genealogy of using scientific knowledge and medical interventions to control, surveil, document, and punish unruly bodies, their sexual practices, desires, and relationships by continuing to coerce trans people into not having children in really restricted ways of being in society. In this work, I'm kind of working within a couple of different contributions. First of all, there's not a lot of insight onto the social control of trans people and how it's tied to the development of medical and scientific knowledge about marginalized people in general. This work also builds on the social construction of knowledge and how norms become embedded in scientific and medical knowledge and practices by examining how the so-called model or ideal trans patient was built directly from reproductive control, which links trans reproduction to other lasting concerns in reproductive health. And I'm also tracing how knowledge about gender, sex, and reproduction accumulated in trans medicine and has continued to influence knowledge and practices in other areas of science and medicine, and as applied to marginalized people, including immigrants, cisgender women, expecting parents, and people of color. And with that, I'll go ahead and say thank you very much. And I very much look forward to your questions, comments, anything that you might want to share or that we can discuss. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I will let you handle your own moderation, but I will help if things start, coming up in the chat that you're not seeing because you're answering questions or whatever. I guess the thing to do is either put questions in the Q&A or in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, Edwin or I can unmute you also so that you can ask your question. Oh, okay. So Edwin has unlocked the ability to turn on your audio and video. So feel free to turn your cameras on if you would like, even if you don't want to ask a question, and feel free to raise your hand, unmute, ask questions. There is a question in the chat from Pat Arnold. First off, this is such phenomenal research, and I'm continually in awe of hearing your work and how you weave together these narratives. Question: there was a parallel control of at least Black bodies and disabled bodies in reproductive medicine at the mid-20th century to today, or at the mid-century. I guess I'm assuming mid-20th century. I am wondering how the intersection of race or disability impacted the control exerted on trans bodies, e.g. for Black trans or disabled trans patients. Did those layers shift the meaning of gender and therefore change the standard that trans patients had to meet? Or did it make by default sterilization essentially mandatory as part of any medical care?
Yeah, Pat, thank you so much for this question. And it certainly is something that I am consistently consider, like I'm just always thinking about like links across different marginalized groups. I will say, and I think I mentioned this to Mindy and also Shoma months ago, that one question that I had for all of you is that when I look at this data of reproductive and social control, I see eugenics all over it. And I don't know if anyone noticed that I completely swerved around using that language, because I've gotten kind of mixed feedback from other scholars about whether or not we can even talk about eugenics for trans people in the mid-20th century, and if that makes sense. So I guess like to tackle part of your question here, Pat, I think that part of the story that I'm telling in like just the historical context is that how providers and how scientists approach trans people during this time is absolutely influenced by eugenicist thinking from their earlier 20th century counterparts. And I think they're importing a lot of those ways of thinking about, respectable, like so-called respectable lives, and what it means to help people move through society in a way that is like affirmed by medicine and science is very much wrapped up into similar conversations that scientists and doctors were having about poor people, about folks of color, about people with disabilities, about those that were called feeble-minded. I see it all over the data, even though it's happening about 30 years later. And I think that implicates trans medicine and the development of medical knowledge and how science wielded authority. It situates it within like, unfortunately, trans people also joining a legacy of eugenics. When it comes to, and I think like this is, so I'll kind of think through the second part of your question. Like one thing that I have become mindful of recently is like the question of absences in archives. And I know there's historians on this call as well who probably could do this much more justice than I could. But as far as like when it comes to the Harry Benjamin collection and the John Money collection, there's a lot of absences or silences when it comes to trans folk who inhabit multiply marginalized positions. So it happened, like folks come up every once in a while. But it's why I've started shifting to looking at the digital trans archives, because it's a little bit more of like a crowdsourced archive that includes more data, more narrative from trans people themselves, and has a lot more information about like Black trans people or trans people with disabilities. So I'm still like very much in the data collection and sifting and sorting process. But it is on my mind that like how medical providers in the scientific community are borrowing ideas and it's tracing through this history of trans medicine as well. So, yeah. Oh, sorry. And there's just one more tiny question there. Was sterilization mandatory as part of medical care? So I am starting to find evidence that at least in the 50s to the 70s that it wasn't like you must have this happen, but it was assumed that all trans people would want it. So discussions of trans people, like a careful discussion of trans people who might want to have children, and like that wasn't even in the realm of the possibility for like providers or scientists up until about the 2010s. So it wasn't like you must do this, but it was assumed that all trans people should get sterilized. And I think I need more data to help me sort through like like what precisely like where that logic comes from. So um let's see.
Can you follow them right now in the chat, or do you want me to read them to you?
I'm trying my best.
So it looks like the next one was a question about how to characterize the status of medicine and transgender populations today. Oh, and there's a hand up. Eunice, did you want to ask that question?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, that is exactly what I'm asking. How do you perceive the medical profession's approach to transgender populations today? So I didn't ask it very well in the written, so I thought I'd better come back.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So I think there's a little bit of a push and pull happening right now in the medical establishment, and it depends on which part we're looking to. I think that, and I think Andrea is on the call. Their work is showing, Andrea Kelly's currently a postdoc in Briggs, but a lot of their work shows how, like, if we're looking at medical students, there's a huge enthusiasm and energy to bring more gender-affirming curriculum into the formal education process. Because right now that's still not happening. But if we're looking to practicing providers, it's kind of split. So like now I'm drawing on my first book, but there are some providers who are like, I am willing to work with trans people. I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'll do the best I can. And sometimes that has really incredibly far-reaching negative consequences. And sometimes there are also providers who are like not only willing to, but I want to work with trans people. So they recognize that there is something, within like healthcare that consistently creates roadblocks for trans people, not only for gender affirming care, but for any health concern they might have. And so there are some providers who are actively working with trans people and trying to level health disparities. But when it comes to children, I think that it gets a little complicated. So if we go back to the 2010s, as some of these associations were like, oh, maybe trans people want kids, and we don't know how hormones might affect their capacity to do so. Let's start talking to younger trans people, like trans youth, about the possibility of having kids. And now I'm looking to Carla for this one, but I think that I think what that does is it recreates hierarchies within the trans community because not everyone can afford to preserve their egg or sperm. And it really is a class-driven factors for younger trans people who are now being encouraged to think about like their future children if they want them. But there's still not like great mechanisms unless you come from affluence. So
Thank you. So it looks like the next
thank you.
question is, much has been written about the savvy ways that trans people navigated normative expectations and gatekeeping by delivering expected narratives, regardless of actual identity and experience, in order to access needed medical care. In your review of Benjamin's narratives, do you have any sense of whether or not he may have been engaging in similar practices with his colleagues, i.e. echoing normative expectations as an accomplice to his patients in the normative medical world?
yeah, I think Carla, that's a really interesting question. I think that Benjamin, like most humans, was a complicated person. And like when you're looking at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters that are authored by the same person, it's hard not to like get into the mindset of that human. I think with Benjamin, he was sympathetic to trans people, and I think that he like identified what would help his colleagues feel more comfortable working with trans people. But there's also evidence to suggest that he played into and also believed some of those stereotypes. So he was much less willing to work with trans people of color. He had really disfavorable attitudes towards trans people who were in poverty or under or unemployed. He didn't he wrote horrible things sometimes about trans people who are not gender conforming to their target gender. So I think it's difficult to parse, like, did he believe these things or not? But I certainly know that the impact was he helped establish a model of care that blocked a lot of people from being able to access it and to experience like pretty severe health inequalities and discrimination in health encounters. So.
Thank you. So the next question is, we know that many of the misconceptions of trans people in healthcare are still very prevalent today. Do you have suggestions for how we can improve perception of trans people in care, especially in states that are very anti-trans?
Yeah. I'm teaching a class in LGBTQ plus studies through the GenCen, and my students and I talk a lot about this. And I think there might be a few on this call too. Um, I think where it gets tricky is that there's a lot of like tropes of trans people, and I think over time, like now my mind's going in a couple different directions. One pathway is that there are some folks who believe that with new public attention on trans people and trans youth, that like that's a positive movement because more people are aware that trans people exist. But I think that like the cultural studies part of my brain, the other pathway is also like, but with more and more public attention on trans people, we're getting more and more of a restricted tropes of what it means to be trans and what it like looks like to be trans. And healthcare providers are not immune to public perception and tropes and like stereotypes. So I think that like one of the big concerns in healthcare is the assumption that's carried forward from the 1950s that to be a real or true or proper trans person, of course, I'm using all those words with air quotes, that you have to be a binary identified trans person, so a trans man or a trans woman who's gender conforming. If you're a trans man, you're into really masculine things and you want to have masculine jobs. And if you're a trans woman, you're really feminine and want to have like so-called feminine marked jobs. And it really puts non-binary people in the lurch. Because, and interviewing health providers for a different project, they would say things like, I do not know how to work with non-binary people. That's just not how the medical model has established our way of understanding treatment plans. So like, do I give them a little bit of estrogen? And they say it mildly tongue in cheek, but I think that they're also being serious. Like they don't like ambiguity in medicine is very difficult for physicians to reconcile. So how do you change that? I think it's partly about changing cultural norms and expectations about and like undercutting a lot of these prevalent tropes about trans people and what a so-called real trans person is. And then for states that are anti-trans, I mean, this also is becoming another way that class matters, I think, in trans movements is if you are a parent or parents or guardians and you've got a trans kid and you have the means to move out of that state, I think that's the option that a lot of folks who have access to wealth are pursuing. But it means that for those who come from working class families, like they don't have many options. So, for those states that are anti-trans, it's re-stratifying the trans community and the kinds of experiences that trans people will have. So how can we improve that? I don't know. I mean, I think part of it is about helping to change the narrative that you know, like that has like narratives that have been circulating since the 50s about the character of trans people, their reliability and their worth as humans. So.
Yeah, thank you. Next, we have a question about teaching, which is, your work is such a welcome addition to an emerging body of much needed trans histories. How might we better make such histories accessible to undergraduate students? And do you see the film Framing Agnes as an effective vehicle for beginning this process?
Wait, did you just merge two questions in one?
Did I?
I don't know.
I don't think so.
Okay, okay.
That's Tim's question. I think I just read it as it was, but maybe there was another question too.
Oh no, sorry. I think my mind was doing that. I just blended the two questions. Yeah. So let's see. I'm just gonna take a second to read back over it so I make sure that I'm fully answering the question. Okay. So I think for the question about how to make histories accessible to undergraduate students, I think that one really powerful mode is the introduction and the just explosion of oral histories that are now available with like a couple of clicks of a button. So with my students, for example, sometimes I'll bring in my own artifacts like from the work that what I use in my own work. And then we sit with those letters of correspondence and I ask for my students to just start creating questions like, what do they mean when they talk about like so-called degenerates? Or like, why are these doctors so concerned about trans people not being publicly read as trans? Like, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean in that time period? So I have found in my teaching that bringing in data, like historical data, provokes really lively conversations. And I also think that like there's more of an acknowledgement, and I certainly am in my classrooms like humble about my own limitations. And I think that the oral histories do a lot of work to bring in different and more diverse trans voices into the classroom so that students are asked to grapple with, like thinking back to Pat's question, like what does it mean to be a Black trans woman in the 1960s, and what is that experience like? And I think that oral histories especially can help address some of those absences that we would typically otherwise see. So, and I have not yet seen that film, so I will go check it out.
You'll report back later on that second part. So the next question is, what do you think of the societal environmental attitudes around trans healthcare today as compared to the 20th century? For example, the 20th century appeared to be about controlling trans people within their healthcare. And today, while control within medical institutions is still prevalent, there now appears a large push to end trans healthcare completely. I also wonder what your thoughts are on how attitudes of trans reproductive control of the 20th century relate to contemporary attitudes, controversy around transgender kids.
Yeah. I mean, I think there can be a little bit of, so I'm thinking right now of some of the I'm thinking about the first book, and I would go and observe healthcare conferences where they were speaking at it was trans healthcare conferences. And a lot of providers would begin their scripted notes by talking about how there's been such progress in trans medicine, and there's everything's gotten so much better since the so-called dark days of the 1950s. And as a sociologist, that is an intriguing empirical question. Have things gotten better, and if so, how? And I think that that's the idea that as time moves forward, that things just get better is a powerful narrative that might not be substantiated by empirical data. So the kinds of concerns that doctors have right now about trans kids sounds a lot to my ears, like the concerns that they had about non-binary people in the 2010s and the general concerns that doctors had about trans people in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So I do tend to take perhaps a slightly more skeptical view. that yes, there has been improvement in healthcare overall, but there's still a lot of gaps and a lot of challenges that trans people experience that are not new. Like they're 75 plus years and still going. So one of the concerns, and I try to be really careful about this in my first book, because I'm aware that it is an idea that is used by mostly conservative legislators to try to ban trans care. But if you look at like their rhetoric, they talk a lot about like this is experimental, these are experimental procedures. We don't have great evidence. There's no scientific evidence to support these practices. And it's not comfortable to talk about even among those of us in the trans community, but they're not entirely wrong. I think the conclusion we might draw is very different, that therefore we should probably go out and start collecting data and perhaps could have 75 years ago. But when I look at like the state of evidence, for example, in trans medicine, and I think about like how quickly like when COVID started unfolding in the country, how quickly like all of the tools of medicine and science were leveraged and mobilized to better understand what is this emergent illness. And I'm not saying that being trans is an illness, by the way, but taking that and comparing it to all of the lasting uncertainty, all of the problematic evidence or just lack of scientific consensus around trans medicine, and like COVID and trans medicine, like it's just, I think it's problematic and disappointing, but it's something that we need to reconcile. So what are the contemporary concerns? I think that we just don't know a lot. We know that mental health improves when trans people can access care, like full stop, like that's just how it is. But we don't know about if you put a trans kid on hormones, what does that do 15 years later? And like, it's uncomfortable, but we don't have great data. And so, yeah, and I think that is part of the controversy around trans kids is it's not just about that they're transgender, it's that in the United States, it's a provocative narrative of paternalistic policymaking. And it's kind of insidious when you think about how legislators are trying to ban trans care in the name of protecting trans kids from themselves. I think partially because of those narratives of like kids aren't mature enough or they don't know themselves well enough to make like such a big decision. But when you talk to trans kids, like they're pretty clear what they need and what they want. So I think on that front, trans kids unfortunately have come to be like symbolic of broader social anxieties about childhood and also about gender.
Yeah, thank you for that really sort of complicated answer. I really appreciated your comments there. There's a comment in the chat. The Gender and Sexuality Center has a 6-module series on D2L that helps begin to understand the differences in trans people. I found it very helpful in beginning to understand. There's so much I'd never heard about. And there's much to learn. It's an excellent beginning source. The larger population just doesn't know. So recommending that, have you seen that? Do you recommend that? Any comments on that?
I will admit I am not familiar with the 6-module series. I've certainly benefited in my professional life and also my colleagues have with some workshops that the center has put on. So I know that they're really thoughtful and, updated with knowledge about trans and non-binary issues. So, yeah.
Thank you. So other questions, remember that you can raise your hand or just unmute and ask a question as well. So we both teach in women's and gender studies, right? So like, how long should I wait? But it looks like there is another question in the chat. We can sit here all afternoon, student. No. So there's a question just on the topic of control and uncertainty. How do you see the rise of self-directed gender affirming care via services like Folks Help fitting into this narrative? Maybe this is too new a development to comment on.
Yeah, Pat, I have a couple of colleague, friend, mentor folks in my life who do live in states that are starting to shut down care for trans youth. And one of my responses was because like moving is not attainable, even for people who have wealth. Like you can't, like a lot of people cannot just pick up and move to another state. And I was for a while recommending that they check out something like Folks because it's like a telehealth service for people who are unfamiliar, that has, a lot of times trans and non-binary providers who are willing and want to work with trans people, and youth are included in that. So they have like, it's like a one-stop telehealth shop. But then I always think about, one of my students always brings us back to capitalism and the precarity of like what it means to live in a society that's, like economically driven. If you look closely at places like Folks, it's a pay-to-play health offering. So you have to pay a monthly fee. Insurance does not cover it. So like, once again, we're talking about access to services that are available to a very small portion of people who can afford it. And when we look at like adult trans and adult non-binary people, what we also know is that socially, like we tend to be unemployed. The rates of poverty for trans and non-binary people is much higher than cisgender populations. So I mean, in theory, I like the idea of a telehealth service that offers gender-affirming care, but I also want to be cautiously mindful that it is going to be cost prohibitive for the majority of trans and non-binary people. Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe that is it for the questions. Do you have any concluding comments, or do you feel like you've said anything we didn't ask you that you wanted to mention?
I mean, there's a part of me that is curious about other people's responses to the question that I posed. I kind of like pulled into my thoughts and then ran away from it. But if anyone is open to sharing even gut reactions or responses to the question of like, is like just I don't know what to do with like, is this social and reproductive control or is it eugenics, So if anyone would like to stay and share, I would love to hear. Yeah, Andrea.
Yeah, I thank you so much. This has been such a fantastic talk, and we'll definitely talk more because I see threads between your archival work and some of the work I had previously done. Very excited about that. I really think that it is both. I think that it makes sense. Also, I worry that folks telling you to not use the word eugenics or things like that is more a way to comfort right, a white cisgender cissexist kind of audience. So I would say to not shy away from that, especially given kind of the security right that you have now with tenure and the career grant. And if NSF says they don't like it, then things I probably shouldn't say in a publicly recorded type of thing. But no, I think that
Out of the recording if we want to.
yes, you can just bleep it. No, in all seriousness, I think that your work really speaks to a space where those areas of eugenics and reproductive and social control are very much, if not one and the same, then certainly very intimately connected. And I think especially where you speak about, trans folks of color, and you're talking about, the one, a Black trans woman, kind of navigating these spaces, and the ways that that also connects to other eugenics movements, through the 18th, 19th century or 19th, 20th centuries. I definitely, would say, like, please don't shy away from that language. I think that that is something that makes a very strong statement about the history of a trans medicine, but also just, has ties to where we are today. And I think that the legacy of that type of thinking is really important to continue exploring.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Can you, what's the pushback? I mean, specifically that you're receiving on that? What's it look like?
I think that from my understanding, for some historians, they think of eugenics as being situated in a very particular time period. And because my work begins mostly in the 1950s, and that is a moment where a lot of historians of eugenics will talk about that there was this shift from coercive sterilization to social promotion of certain families. But I think that that's why it makes trans medicine so messy of a case study of eugenics, because like they're a little late to the game, like the providers are like, oh, from their understanding, like there's a mostly new population, although I know that a lot of historians have also talked about the like trans medicine. It did not start in the 1950s, it started earlier, but where it really started coalescing as a field was the 1950s. And so I think that some historians have been like, by the 1950s, coercive sterilization and like strong arming people into not having children like just was not a thing. And I'm like, but I think that that's why it's important to talk about it in the context of trans medicine. Like in trans medicine, they're borrowing from both, like coercively sterilizing or limiting the reproductive capacity, and also upholding certain respectable kinds of families or expressions or ways of living. So it's like colliding right at the site of trans medicine. And some folks have just found that to be too, I don't know, like messy is not the right word, but they're concerned that I'm taking a particular moment in time and trying to apply an older concept to that era. So yeah.
I mean, as a historian, I think that sounds like not a super compelling set of claims against you, actually. I think that first of all, I think it's false that there was a major shift. I think probably for some groups of people, right? As you're kind of gesturing to, right? I think maybe, yeah, for some groups of people, you might have seen that kind of shift to where forced sterilizations aren't happening, but like I can think of a couple of forced sterilization efforts that are going on after the 50s, right? So like, and I think that stuff doesn't come out of nowhere, right? People draw on historical concepts, and of course, like this medical literature that's behind you is going to inform how you're seeing it. And if that's eugenicist, if this stuff is eugenicist, I don't see how this is not. So I mean, again, I would have to like look at their critiques a bit more closely, but my sense would be, yeah, concurring with Andrea, that this is like an avenue that is actually worth continuing to pursue, regardless of what people have said. I think they might be on the wrong track, right? They precisely because they're not looking at the sources that you're looking at.
Yeah. I think also, and my graduate student and my undergraduate students who are working with me in the archives right now, and like they put it very simply, like this is like there's really hard parts of those archives, and like especially trying to draw attention to like, look for moments where there's murmurs of eugenics happening. Like it's hard data to work with, but I think that that tells us a lot too, like in how we think about the work that we do, and analyzing any data is like embodied responses to that can tell us a lot as well. So
Yeah,
yeah.
Another historian has just commented right in the chat. Tim is saying historians also like to talk about the long 1960s or the long 1970s. Why not the long eugenics movement, which I think sounds great. Actually, yeah, exactly. Like there's a reason we use this term long, right? It's because these things have after effects. And then Pat says, I've seen more grassroots trans reproductive justice advocates starting to call the system one of health and reproductive apartheid, sharing a core with intersex health, for instance, taking a note from Harriet Washington's work. And then Marissa agreed, it sounds like these eugenic discourses lingered into this emergent medical out of the mainstream, becoming less visible for most medical historians who haven't seen the archive you have. And then Ross, forced sterilization of trans people still continues in some European countries today, with sterilization requirements for trans people to receive gender recognition. And then Carla, I think scholars studying prenatal genetic testing, Down syndrome, contemporary sterilization, and LARC racialized ethnic targeting would agree. So it sounds like you're getting a lot of agreement with you and disagreement with these historians that you're speaking.
Not to pick on the historians, by the way, but it's just
Feel free.
Yeah. See, you didn't even know that you were coming to not only a presentation, but also a workshopping session. So thank you everyone for your comments.
And one more comment from Steph Jordan, Michelle Murphy's economization of life and seizing the means of reproduction also affirms this terminology of eugenics, that if some people can't be born whose survival is not as important as the prosperity of others, then this is social control.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right, so thank you very much. This was a fantastic discussion. Please don't forget to take the survey, participants, and come to our website at the GenCen or write to us at the GenCen if you'd like to be invited to more of our events if you are not already. Thank you very much, Professor Shuster.
Yeah, and thank you again, everyone, for your engagement and thinking with me. So thank you.